YouTube. Got the nod. If you'd all rise for the opening prayer, thank you. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. While you're standing, we'll move to the recognition of the traditional landholders. I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting here today on the traditional land of the Barakalong people of the Gunai-Kurnai Nation, and I pay respect to their elders past and present. If there are other elders present, I would also like to acknowledge them. If you'd like to take a seat. I'd also like to welcome in the gallery the members of our Youth Council coming along to enjoy their evening. Members of the gallery, conditions of entry. All members of the community attending the council meeting are asked to behave in a courteous and respectful manner before, during and after the meeting, and respectively this includes no placards, posters or materials other than personal effects. In accordance with the local law, the chair may order and cause the removal of any person, including a councillor or youth councillor, who disrupts any meeting or fails to comply with the direction. Live streaming. Council is currently live streaming council meetings, and speakers here tonight will be included in the audio recording. They will not be shown on the video. If you do have any concerns with this, please speak to a council officer. The council officers are located on the back wall of the chamber. Recording of council meetings. In accordance with Local Law 1, please be advised that a person must not operate audio tape or other recording equipment at any council meeting without first obtaining the consent of the council or the chair. Such consent may at any time during the course of such a meeting be revoked by council or the chair. Move on to the business of the day, councillors. Are there any apologies? Looking around, I see there are no reasons for apologies as you're all here. Declarations of interest, councillors. Nobody?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
17.2, the annual sponsorship program.
Okay, no worries. Any other councillors' declarations of interest? No. Move on to the adoption of minutes of the last ordinary council meeting. That's the August council meeting. Do I have a mover? Councillor Gibson. Somebody to second? Councillor Law. Any opposition? No opposition. Nobody wishing to speak on that basis. Declare that carried unanimously. Move on to acknowledgements. Councillors may raise any formal acknowledgements that need to be made at this time. Councillor Harriman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge a young lady in our community who has excelled sporting-wise. That's Jade Melbourne. Jade is a product of the Traralgon T-Birds basketball team and also a member of Latrobe City Energy, and she's now gone on to represent the Boomers in Melbourne. Over the last couple of weeks, Jade has been part of the Australian Under-19 Sapphires team that took out the FIBA Oceanic Championships, and she was actually named Player of the Final Series and Australian Player of the Tournament. So I just thought that was a exceedingly good outcome for a local basketballer that started off here as an under-8 and has stayed here as long as she could all the way through. So I just wanted to congratulate her.
Very good, thank you. Any other acknowledgements, councillors? No more. On that basis, we'll move on to public question time. There are no public questions. Means we move on to speakers, and I believe we do have a speaker. Yes, Mr. Jim Vivian speaking on item 17.2. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's the item you disclosed. So we'll wait till Councillor White leaves the room and ask Mr. Vivian to come up to the lectern. You have 15, certainly don't have 15 minutes. You have 3 minutes, Mr. Vivian, and then if you'd remain there to take questions from the councillors if necessary. So your time starts now.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Jim Vivian. I'm the board chair of the Gippsland Sports Academy, and I will start by giving a brief overview of the Sports Academy and what we actually do. The GSA is one of 6 regional sports academies in Victoria. Others are in Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, Sunraysia and Warrnambool. We currently have programs in 6 sports: tennis, swimming, netball, volleyball, gymnastics and clay target shooting. All 6 Gippsland councils currently contribute sponsorship to the Academy and the Gippstar Awards. The aim of the GSA is to assist young athletes in Gippsland become the best they can be in both their sporting and general life. The young athletes are identified as being very talented or have the potential to become elite in their sport. The GSA provides specialist sports skills coaching. Usually specialist coaches are out of the Gippsland region. Some of our coaches have represented Australia at Olympic level. We also provide specialist sports science programs in strength and conditioning, sports psychology and nutrition. The GSA would usually deliver programs to between 150 and 200 young athletes per year. Generally, 30 to 40% of these are from Latrobe City. The GSA also utilises a variety of Latrobe City leisure centres to deliver its programs. Over the years, the GSA has assisted many athletes in realising their goals to represent their region, state and country in a range of events, including Commonwealth, Paralympics and Olympic Games. In conclusion, the GSA contributes to the development of a significant number of young Gippsland athletes, with many of them residing in the Latrobe City catchment area. These athletes develop skills around healthy lifestyles that will stay with them and their families for life. As stated earlier, all 6 Gippsland councils currently contribute to the GSA and have done so for over 20 years. It is most important that this unified across Gippsland support continues, so as to send a strong message that the GSA offers opportunity to all young Gippslanders who want to pursue sporting excellence. Thank you for allowing me to present tonight and for your consideration of our sponsorship application.
Thank you, Mr Vivian. Councillors, Mr Vivian was talking to item 17.2, the annual sponsorship program, the 1920 sponsorship program. Are there any questions for Mr Vivian? Got off very lightly. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Could the ushers please admit Councillor White? It's true. Councillors, Councillor White having joined us, we now move on to item 9, notices of motion. These are notices of motion by councillors. First one is the State Government Landfill Levy. I believe, Councillor Harriman, you are the mover.
Correct.
And I take it, Councillor Gibson, that you are seconding.
Yes, please, and foreshadowing.
And foreshadowing, okay. Just note that. Right, councillors, do we have any opposition? There being no opposition, does any councillor wish to speak? I'm sure you would, Councillor Harriman.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The reason I've put this up, Mr Mayor, is over the last couple of years, the state government has gouged from Latrobe City ratepayers $11,971,364 and not forgetting the 10 cents. The return on this landfill levy to Latrobe City ratepayers has been basically zero. we now face an outcome where we have a state government that was sitting on over $600 million in a landfill levy designed to assist the recycling industry, and we've seen it collapse. This, while it hasn't put a strain on us yet at Latrobe City, and we haven't had to, like some metropolitan councils, start putting recycling material into landfill, it still irks me somewhat that we have a state government that has taken $11 million, nearly $12 million from Latrobe City ratepayers, and we have got no benefit to the recycling industry. So this notice of motion asks that if the state government's just going to sit on it to balance their budget, that they return the $11,971,364.10, small amount if you say it quickly, return it to the ratepayers in Latrobe City, or invest it, the entire amount, into a legitimate waste recycling program, starting with fully funding the Gippsland Waste and Resource Recovery Group and other waste and resource recovery groups across Victoria. For a number of years, the Gippsland Waste and Resource Recovery Group has not been fully funded, has not had the opportunity to run programs that have proven to be of benefit into reducing landfill material. And I just find it very, very disappointing that we're teaching our children, teaching our kids, pushing our community to recycle properly. The government's sitting on this money and not doing anything with it, so that we end up with a situation where you had SKM with 4 times the MCG worth of rubbish sitting in warehouses that keeps catching on fire, where we've got councils at the moment storing it in paddocks, storing it in any shed they can, because we've got nowhere to send it, because we don't have a recycling facility for all the recycling goods in Victoria. I look at the work the Gippsland Waste and Resource Recovery Group has done, and it's been exceptional, absolutely exceptional. But they could have done far, far more with the money that's actually come from all the councils across Gippsland. And you look at how much Latrobe's put in and multiply that by the 6 other councils, it's a fairly substantial amount of money. And I know our local member from the government will say, well, we've put $2.5 million into the waste energy from waste program at, nearly finished, Mr Mayor, at waste energy from waste at Australian Paper, which is great, but all that waste is actually coming from the southeastern metro of Melbourne, and obviously the money for that $2.5 million should have come out of their account. Even if you take it out of ours, it still leaves over $9 million that we've lost. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Harriman. Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I agree with what my fellow councillor has said, apart from a couple of years. It's been more than a couple of years. It's been decades, I would suggest. And so if you've got 11 million there and the royalties from power stations, that's going in the tens of millions of dollars, that's over $20 million out of our community. I suggest that the money needs to flow back.
Thank you, Councillor Gibson. Would any other councillor wish to speak? If not, Councillor Harriman, you can close.
Just quickly, Mr Mayor, this is money that's come directly out of the ratepayer's pocket. This is money that was not taken by Latrobe City Council. This is money that the state government forces Latrobe City Council to collect for them. The only money, large amount of money, that they've spent out of the landfill levy was over $100 million to replace the computers system at Parks Victoria, which I think has a lot to do with recycling of goods. The only impact it actually had was more bloody computers ending up in landfill. So it's just really, really abhorrent of this government to not spend the money where it's meant to be spent, to let it stockpile to balance their budget, and then to jump on councils because the recycling companies in Melbourne have got nowhere to send it. And we don't have a recycling industry. I'm sure if we spent 300 or 400 million, we could find one very, very quickly, very, very efficiently, and councils like this wouldn't be struggling to deal with a problem that's of the state government's making. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Harriman. Whilst there was no opposition, we've had speakers, so we'll have to put it to the vote. Those in favour, Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor Callaghan, Councillor Clancy and myself. I declared that carried unanimously. Councillor Callaghan, I noticed that your electronic agenda has failed. Do you have sufficient... My question is, do you have enough paper? You have. Okay. Councillor Gibson, you foreshadowed a motion to follow Councillor Harriman's motion.
Yes, please.
That is on the screen at the moment. So you are moving
that.
and we are seeking a seconder for that motion.
Happy to
Councillor
second,
Harriman,
Mr.
you're
Mayor.
seconding that. Any opposition, councillors? There being no opposition, I'll ask Councillor Gibson, do you wish to speak? And the answer of
Just
course
shortly.
is yes.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What this motion is about is getting council's approval to put this up for the State Assembly or the State Council meeting for MAV, which is all the councils in Victoria having the State Council meeting. And what we're asking is for the state government to return to councils all the remaining funds from the Victorian government, Sustainability Fund. Now, as you've just heard, that's the money that's been collected from local councils. We have a huge problem with our recycling and it needs to be fixed. So if the state government's got a choice, they either fix it or give us back the money, because at the moment the councils are wearing all the brunt of the problem that exists. So that motion is to go before the State Assembly to have the approval, hopefully, from all the councils, and I suggest that should be straight through because they're all in this mess together. So I'd ask my councillors to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gibson. Councillor Harriman. Okay. Any other councillor wish to speak? Yes, certainly. Councillor White.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I rise in support of this motion, and I think that it's important that we do give a key focus on this issue, because it's like the councillors who have spoken already have indicated that there's a significant amount of funds that have been generated for the state through these landfill levies, and we do know that some of that money has been utilised for the purpose of projects such as remediation of gun club sites, I should say, taking decisive action on climate change and energy affordability, so, to just name a couple. But I think that that message hasn't really come through to us, and the amount that's been allocated is, I think, significantly small versus the amount that's been collected. And so I think that what we're really saying to the state government is that come on, get real, and let's really have an impact on our community, because obviously that's what the funds are there for, and they really, you know, at this particular point in time, we haven't really felt the impact positively in any way, shape or form.
Thank you, Councillor White. Any other councillor wish to speak? If not, Councillor Gibson, do you wish to close?
No, thank you.
Okay. Councillors, we didn't have any opposition, but we have had speakers, so I'll ask those in favour. Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor O'Callaghan, Councillor Clancy and myself. Carried unanimously. Still in notices of motion by councillors, we'll move on to item 9.2, which is about waterway maintenance, which has been put forward by Councillor Gibson, who becomes the mover. Do I have a seconder? Oh, Councillor Law, I'm sorry, didn't see you. Seconded by Councillor Law. Is there any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Councillor Gibson, do you wish to speak?
Just quickly, Mr. Mayor, as you know, we've had a long-running issue with the creeks in our municipality. we've asked the government, they've put it back to the catchment authority, they've said we haven't got any money, and at the end of the day, they look like a tip. So what we're doing is asking the actual ministers who are involved with this this issue to come down and see firsthand what we're actually speaking about. Now, if we were in Melbourne, the amenity is a hell of a lot better, but because we're not in Melbourne, it's viewed that we're a bit different, and the level of maintenance and work done on our creeks is less because we're not in Melbourne. I find that's above and beyond, and I would ask respectfully for the ministers to come down and actually view the situation, and then who's going to be responsible for the ongoing work and the maintenance and the cost, because time and time again it's council who has been the bearers of the cost of everything. So that's why I'm asking them to come down. They can see firsthand what we're speaking about, and hopefully then they will actually address the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gibson. Councillor Law. Okay. Would any other councillor like to speak? Being no other speakers, Councillor Gibson, do you wish to close? Okay. Councillors, we've had a speaker, so we will have to vote. Those in favour? Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor Callaghan, Councillor Clancy and myself, carried unanimously. Right, we'll move on to the main business of the agenda, councillors. Item 13.1 on page 22 of the agenda, Latrobe City Council submission, coal-fired power funding prohibition bill 2017. Do I have a mover?
Move.
Councillor White is the mover. Do I have somebody to second the motion? Councillor Howe, you were quickest. Do I have any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Councillor White, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. As you know, Mr Mayor, in our agendas this evening there is a document there which is Latrobe City Council submission to the Senate Standing Committees on Environment and Communications Inquiry in regard to the coal-fired power funding prohibition bill 2017. And so from this council's point of view, we are of the view that we're opposing the bill as it is, and urge the government to ensure that the impacts on the Latrobe Valley, as is mentioned in the report by the way, the impacts on the Latrobe Valley from the changes to the energy sector are considered through effective planning, engagement and support for just transition to reduce disproportionate adverse impacts on our region. The Latrobe City and its community are that we want to be closely consulted and collaborated with throughout all phases of any transition that may occur. And as part of the region's economic diversification, low emissions technology and alternative use of carbon from brown coal, such as hydrogen production, are actively supported by the government. And so, Mr Mayor, obviously there's some real concerns within our community and at a number of different levels in relation to the issue of the future of coal. And even tonight's Express, there's an article in there that's indicating concerns by one of our major generators. And I think that the important thing for me, Mr Mayor, to really accentuate here is that I think that coal takes a bigger hit than it deserves. And I think if we talk about fossil fuels, we're not just talking about coal, we're talking about oil, we're talking about gas. And obviously we recognise that climate change is a fact of life. Climate change has been with us forever, and we need to be continually adapting to those changing climatic conditions that we are experiencing. And I think that that's where it behoves us all as a community as a whole to look at smart ways of going about the future. We recognise that through fossil fuels, and I'm talking about coal, I'm talking about gas, I'm talking about oil, all produce CO2, which is supposedly is the big ogre and the big issue as far as atmospheric conditions are concerned, and the warming of the planet. And so in that regard, what needs to be happening, I believe, is that a greater focus and effort going into research and development, such as that which is able to potentially happen through Australian Carbon Innovation, the organisation that's based out here at Federation University, in terms of research and development in regard to the use of coal into the future in a more efficient way. And as you probably heard me say before, Mr Mayor, that in Germany right now there is an organisation that is capturing CO2, and as a result of a catalytic process converting the CO2 into a polyol, which is then able to be used in replacing oil as part of the ingredients that make this product, which are mattresses, which are synthetic surfaces of playing fields. Thank you.
Can I move an extension, Mr Mayor?
Seconded, Councillor Howe.
Thank you.
Any opposition? No opposition. Continue, Councillor White.
Synthetic surfaces of playing fields, and also more recently I'm advised that there's further development going on in relation to the manufacture of fibre that will enable the production of clothing, etc. So what I'm saying, Mr Mayor, is that there is really an opportunity for innovation here in Australia, and not beyond Australia for that matter, to find ways of effectively using the CO2 as a productive product rather than seeing it as the big bad problem. And we've got examples here of what's possible. And the other, of course, issue with the coal is the alternative uses of the coal resource, and such as the HESC project, which is the Hydrogen Energy Supply Chain project, which is a great project that's happening here in the pilot phase now, Mr Mayor, in regard to coming online in terms of working with Kobe Steel and Kawasaki in Japan to make take advantage of the coal that we have here, and using it in a way that means that when it's applied in Japan, that the CO2 is taken out of the equation. So I think that, Mr Mayor, this document here hopefully emphasises, back to the Senate inquiry, that we want to be part of the conversation, we want to be part of the solution, and we want people to recognise, and those who are the decision makers to recognise, and not only those, but those who are investors to recognise, that there is an alternative use for the coal resource. There is a better, smarter way of doing it. Come on, get on board and make it happen.
Thank you, Councillor White. Councillor Howe.
I was going to say something, but Councillor White pretty much said everything I had.
That's fair enough too. And I've waited 10 months as Mayor to have a councillor use the term behoves. So, tremendous. Any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I really have issue with this bill because, and I'll quote, the bill would prohibit the Commonwealth Government or its agencies from funding the refurbishment, building or purchase, or assisting in the transfer of ownership or of a coal-fired power station. Now, the owner utilising the station, even if it's zero emissions, can't do. So what are we actually after? Are we after utilising something that will have zero emissions? But hang on, you can't do that. With this bill, you cannot do that. Zero emissions, isn't that what it's all about? Oh, it's the emissions, they're big bad, whatever, because of all the emissions. But hang on, if there are projects that are zero emissions, no, can't do, because unless the common owners who have them now wish to go down that track, no, can't do. So you've got a resource here that different ones will say how long the resource will last, but all of that goes down the tube. So what are we all about? Mind you, I was at a function only recently that the Youth Action Climate Change had, and I said to them, so if you could use coal and it was zero emissions, are you still anti-coal? And they said yes. And that's what they're telling all the school kids. So I really have issues with this. What are we about? Is it zero emissions? Do you want to just turn the lights out, shut the door as everyone leaves the valley? What are we about? So I do have a huge issue about this bill. Common sense, where is it? That'll do.
Thank you, Councillor Gibson. Would any other councillor like to speak? Councillor Harriman.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Just to put it in perspective about why Latrobe City opposes this bill, we recently had the New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern have a go at the Oceanic Pacific Conference about Australia should shut down all its coal-fired power stations. Just put it in perspective, the sheep in New Zealand produce 4 to 5 times the amount of CO2 gases as the Latrobe Valley does, and they produce more CO2 per year than every coal-fired power station in Australia does. That's just putting it in a little bit of perspective. Second perspective, the fires in Africa at the moment, not the Amazon, the fires in Africa will produce or have produced more CO2 than the coal-fired power stations in Australia will produce for the next decade, and they're still burning. Even a little bit more perspective, we had a natural disaster in Italy, Stromboli volcano, in the last week has put more CO2 and greenhouse gases into the environment than what the Latrobe Valley coal-fired power stations will do over the next 5 years. Let's put it in perspective. We've got farming in New Zealand, which I haven't heard Prime Minister Ardern talk about shutting down, creating more greenhouse gases. We've got fires in Africa, which aren't even getting a mention on the news, producing decades more CO2 than what we do. And we've got a natural volcano, not to mention all the other ones that are active going off around the Pacific Rim at the moment, all producing more CO2 than what we do. What needs to be done, as my 2 fellow councillors have hinted at, is actually start using it. It is a viable product to use. A number of other countries are using it, and there is the grounds to get it down to less than gas-fired emissions, gas-fired power station emissions, and the possibility to get it down to 0 emissions through the use of carbon capture and utilisation. So I fully support Council opposing this bill because it will have devastating effects on this community, not that we seem to get much care out of the state government. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Harriman. Any other councillor wish to speak? No other councillor wish to speak? On that basis, once we've passed the notes amongst the kids, Councillor White, would you like to close?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, I think that at this particular point, Mr Mayor, I concur with the remarks that have been made by the other councillors, and I think it's important to say at this particular point, and I speak for me, but hopefully I'm speaking for the other councillors as well, but we'll find out in a moment, I guess. But what I wanted to say is, let's be clear. I'm not advocating against renewables. I'm saying that we need baseload energy. That's the message that keeps coming through, and that's what baseload generators such as those that we have here in the valley do provide, and so it's all got to be part of the big picture as far as that's concerned. And I'm just thinking while other councillors were speaking just now, just reminding myself of the thoughts I've had previously. But just to the gallery, just think of all the motor vehicles, cars, trucks, etc., that are in Melbourne right now, tootling around the streets and suburbs of Melbourne. Every motor vehicle spitting out CO2 from the oil and or gas that it's used for its energy source. So I think it's important just to keep thinking about it, keep everything in perspective, as Councillor Harriman did say, and I think it's important also, Mr Mayor, that we really emphasise, as this document does, that there needs to be significant further Australian investment in R&D, research and development, to try and find a solution. Let's remind ourselves that the Japanese government, and along with the support of the federal government and the state government of Victoria, have committed significant substantial dollars in relation to this hydrogen to energy project. You know, coal, hydrogen, could we have a hydrogen future here in Australia for that matter? And so what we need to be saying is to the Senate inquiry, don't have the blinkers on, for goodness sake. Coal there's so much of that natural resource here to be exploited in a positive way going forward into the future that we really need to have our eyes open and to be prepared to not be influenced by those who have particular agendas that might be for investment to occur simply in renewables, but this is about really the big picture. Renewables and coal and oil and gas all have a future.
Thank you, Councillor White. Yes, there have been speakers, no dissent but speakers. We'll put your motion to the test. Those in favour? Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor Callaghan, Councillor Clancy and myself. Carried unanimously. Councillors, we move on to item 14.1, Latrobe Creative Precinct Sponsorship and Fundraising, page 35 of the agenda. Do I have a mover for the motion?
Do, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor McFarlane. Somebody to second? Councillor Clancy? Any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Would you like to speak, Councillor McFarlane?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just briefly, this framework is a comprehensive look at the future for our creative precinct. It's a process that has been through the project reference group, and as you're aware, that's a group that represents the key users as well as council representation, who have put a fair bit of effort into getting this document to the council meeting. What the process will allow, Mr Mayor, is for some of those soft items beyond the scope of the project to be afforded, and probably more importantly, it will seek for individual and corporate ownership of our city's, one of our city's newest iconic assets. So this process, Mr Mayor, as the report suggests, will work through the project reference group, who will come back to council with appropriate recommendations from time to time. But it's a good starting point for the next stage of this project. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor McFarlane. Councillor Clancy.
Thanks very much, Mr Mayor. This is a good framework that has been worked up over a long period of time under many different iterations. One of the things that strikes me about this framework that we're putting together for people is it's about community engagement as well. It's got a number of things that sit inside there, like friends of the theatre, people being able to come along. It's actually a pathway to ensure that we have more activation within our new building once it's completed. It's not about getting some extra dollars to put the carpet down or anything like that. It's not about the build, it's not about the fixtures. It's about ownership, and as Councillor McFarlane said, corporate ownership is very, very important. As you would go to any theatre in the world, you'll see naming rights of the boxes or the main auditorium or the green rooms, and that's what this talks about as well. But it also talks about community ownership. As I've been talking to people over the many years about building a new theatre and a creative precinct as it comes now, it's about saying, do we get a chance to buy a brick? Do we get a chance to put our name on a seat? It's about the community, not necessarily about the monetary aspect of it, but about the ownership of their building. This is a council asset, which means it's a community asset, and people want the option to be involved in that, and that's what this framework does.
Thank you, Councillor Clancy. Any other councillor wish to speak? If not, Councillor McFarlane, would you like to close?
I think it's all been said, Mr Mayor.
Okay. Sorry, did I miss you? No. Okay. No oppositions but speakers, councillors, so we'll put it to the vote. Those in favour, Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Harriman, Callaghan and Clancy and myself, carried unanimously. Moving on to item 14.2, Planning Amendment C115, the Mall to Traralgon Employment Corridor. I had 3 words to go. Consideration of submissions.
Hey,
Okay, moved by councillor O'Callaghan. A seconder. Councillor Harriman. Any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Would you like to speak, councillor O'Callaghan?
including bushfire preparedness, impact on residential land and rezoning, and also the amenity and lifestyle precincts that sit in that space. For those familiar with this area, it does have a range of overlays and considerations that need to be taken into account. But it is important to acknowledge that even through the process that's happened to date, there have been residents who have sought to provide council with some feedback in relation to their concerns around how the proposed amendment would impact their current usage of their own land holdings. And it's important for us to go through the completeness of the process, which effectively has an independent panel consider not only our recommendations or our officer's recommendations in terms of the proposed amendment, but also any objections that have been raised by residents and to hear their concerns, and then have a completed report that will provide further guidance as to the acceptance or rejection of the amendment, and provide us with a little further information in relation to that. So just wanted to speak to it, Mr Mayor, because we do have some residents who had some concerns regarding our approach to the amendment, the implication for their property and the way that planning's been undertaken in the proximate area over recent and in the years preceding, and they would like the opportunity to be able to have their matters considered in an independent and objective way. This would also allow that to happen as well. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, councillor O'Callaghan. Councillor Harriman. Okay. Any other councillor wish to speak? No other councillor? You're up again, councillor O'Callaghan. Decline, thank you. No opposition but speaker, so we'll put it to the vote. Those in favour, councillor White, councillor McFarlane, councillor Gibson, councillor Law, councillor Howe, councillor Harriman, councillor O'Callaghan, councillor Clancy and myself, carried unanimously. Move on to item 14.3, which is 2A Crinigan Road Mall, a rezoning request. Do I have a mover? Councillor McFarlane. Do I have some second? Councillor White to second. Do I have any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Councillor McFarlane, would you like to speak and perhaps elaborate what this site is?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Well, we're talking about the site that was the old Crinigan Road primary school site, which has now been vacant for some 2 years. And I might say that the Department of Education and Training have maintained this site quite nicely over that time. And sometimes these sites have a habit of falling into disrepair, but in this instance that is not the case, which is pleasing to see. However, Mr Mayor, given that it is surplus to the department's needs, the government are now looking to proposing to convert it into a neighbourhood residential zoned area, which basically just completes that top end of town. It's a nice high site and potentially will be a beaut spot for someone to perhaps build a house on. But at least we're going to, or this process will allow that land not slipping into disrepair, but have it work back and useful for the community. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McFarlane. Councillor White.
yes, I think just further to the remarks of Councillor McFarlane, The only other thing that perhaps it's worth to point out, just so that it doesn't slip through to the keeper, that is that it's proposed, as I understand it, the amendment to be fast-tracked as an amendment, which was, in that context, doesn't require notification to the surrounding residents or public exhibition. But I'm sure that the community of that area would be very satisfied for it to be able to be rededicated for this particular proposition of a neighbourhood residential zone, as we know it's Schedule 4.
Thank you, Councillor White. Any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor Harriman.
Just quickly, Mr Mayor, while I support the resolution, I just find it disappointing that in other parts of Victoria, land such as this has been handed back to the council at a peppercorn rate. And I just see the ability that council could have used this, particularly with sporting facilities in short supply, and in particular soccer grounds in Morwell, that this would have been a great site for a junior soccer ground. And I'm just disappointed that the government, and in particular the Department of Treasury and Finance, didn't approach council to seek their view on how we could have utilised it. While I'm very happy that they've maintained the site, and as Councillor McFarlane said, in returning to neighbourhood use, it's just disappointing they didn't come to council and seek our input into what it could have been used for. And I just find it's a bit of a loss to the youth of Morwell, that an opportunity to put in another soccer ground which is already there and made use of it. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Harriman. Any other councillor wish to speak? If not, would you like to close, Councillor McFarlane?
Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Okay, having been speakers, we'll put this one to the vote. Those in favour, Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor O'Callaghan, Councillor Clancy and myself, carried unanimously. Move on to item 14.4. Am I going to get a go at this one or not? Okay. Item 14.4, Supreme Court hearing, extension of time application for the development of 16 dwellings at 4, 5 and 6 McClure Court, Traralgon. Page 220 of the agenda. Councillor O'Callaghan.
So moved, Mr Mayor.
That you're the mover and Councillor Howe as the seconder. Okay. Any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Councillor O'Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Many of our residents will be familiar with the matter of McClure Court and the development. Over a period of time, the matter has been considered by council in relation to an initial application, to VCAT appeals, and also outcomes of VCAT determinations. VCAT had determined in council's favour in supporting that matter, which had most recently been put. Unfortunately, the applicant has now applied to the Supreme Court to have the decision of VCAT overturned. This was a decision relating to an extension of time for the application of the planning permit. This matter does not consider the fullness of the application and its appropriateness. It is more around the consideration of questions of law that must be put at the Supreme Court level. The officers are proposing through this resolution that we participate in the Supreme Court hearing. I think it's important for us to do so. We have been advocating strongly for the community's voice and perspective to be heard, but also that our guides and indications around our land use planning and the appropriateness of such an overdevelopment, not only in this area of Traralgon but in other areas, be considered when these matters are reviewed or applied for in relation to council. So from our perspective, it is essential that council be represented in this matter. We are not only a voice for the council and our considerations, but also advocating strongly for the position of the community and ensuring that we not only protect the amenity, but protect the integrity of the planning process and those matters that we put before the courts. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor O'Callaghan. Councillor Howe. Hi, Councillor Howe.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's very important that as a council we're involved and we allow for the development of land in our city to be in an orderly fashion and in lines with the principles of our planning scheme. namely which is Live Work Latrobe. I'm 100% behind Councillor Callaghan in this, and support this fully.
Thank you, Councillor Howe. Would any other councillor wish to speak? No. That means you're up again, Councillor O'Callaghan.
Covered it all, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Okay, application has declined. No opposition councillors but speakers. We'll put it to the vote. Those in favour, Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor Callaghan, Councillor Clancy and myself, carried unanimously. Moving on to item 15.1, Play Space Improvement Plan, Year 4 Actions, Prioritisation of Projects, page 225 of the agenda. Do I?
So move, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Callaghan and Councillor Harriman seconding. Any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Councillor O'Callaghan, would you like to open?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is an important body of work in relation to improvements, in relation to our play spaces across the municipality. Officers have brought to us a range of recommendations to prioritise the projects, and some of them relate to upgrades in relation to fairly significant play spaces within the municipality. Others are smaller pocket park style of arrangements, but still important nonetheless to the neighbourhoods where they do exist. Council has been undertaking a broad range of work across our play spaces for some time now, particularly in relation to health and safety. There were some changes that we needed to make to ensure our compliance, and we have been working through a significant list to ensure that we do prioritise those play spaces, upgrade those that require it, and ensure that there is appropriate recreational facilities available, particularly for our young children and families proximate to their neighbourhoods. So the play spaces in relation to this will be Gilwell Avenue, Traralgon, Queens Parade, there's some areas in Traralgon South Tyres, Freeman Park West, Traralgon, Ollerton Avenue, Newborough, Phillips Street, Moe, and there's also some other priority projects that didn't have that level of high priority but still need to have some work undertaken in consideration and referral to future years, and they are also listed in the report. So very happy to recommend the proposal to my fellow councillors. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor O'Callaghan. Councillor Harriman. Okay. Would any other councillor wish to speak? No speakers. Councillor O'Callaghan, you're up again. Decline, thank you. We've had speakers. Put it to the vote. Those in favour, Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor O'Callaghan, Clance and myself, carried unanimously. Moving on to item 17.1, the 18-19 year accumulated cash surplus. Do I have a mover, councillors? Councillor Gibson. Somebody to second?
Seconded.
White. Opposition, councillors? No opposition. Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm happy to move this. There's a few different projects in here that just don't get funded normally, so I'm more than happy to utilise some of the cash surplus that we do have in order for some much needed projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gibson. Councillor White.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. As is indicated in the report, you can see that at the end of the financial year 2018-19, there was a cash surplus of $3.034 million. And from that, it's been identified that there's a number of projects there that will benefit from an allocation, further allocation to them in some cases, and others are one-offs in order for these projects to be able to be pursued and completed. And not only that, there's a commitment there for a big event coming to Moe, the Big Bash cricket match that's coming there as a major event, and we believe that that'd be important for us as a council to be supporting that. And then the other one, of course, is a safety issue over at the Moe CBD area with regard to the installation of what do you call it, closed circuit television there to be able to make sure that we get a safer environment for some of the localities there that are a little bit concerning at the moment. But and then, of course, we've got a list of others that have been identified as an attachment here to the report, and I think that it's worth to note that late today we did receive advice through our manager, what is he now, corporate organisation? Anyway, just testing, and to advise that the VAGO, the Victorian Auditor General's Office, is now given the all clear in relation to the annual audit as well. So it's all clear.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor Harriman.
Mr Mayor, sorry, and I apologise to Councillor O'Callaghan for talking, Councillor Gibson for talking so much. I just wanted to point out, Mr Mayor, one of the projects that has been funded in this is the centralisation of trainees and apprenticeships program, along with the establishment of an additional 2 apprenticeships, 1 traineeship and 5 Head Start program positions. I just think it's important, Mr Mayor, that the community realise that this council is working to keep our local kids local, and I'd actually put it out there to all the other government organisations, businesses in the region to actually do the same. Start looking at how we can keep our kids local by putting on apprentices, trainees, and working with organisations that are giving our youth a chance. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Harriman. Any other councillor wish to speak? If not, Councillor Gibson, wish to close? Okay. Let's speakers, councillors. Those in favour of the motion, Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. With your indulgence, I would move recommendation 1, recommendation 2 with the words "upon receipt of a completed application" deleted, and then item 3.
Can I ask you to read the item behind me? Does it have your amendments?
It does now.
Okay. Okay, Councillor McFarlane is the mover. Do I have a second? Councillor Gibson is seconding. Any opposition? Councillors, no opposition. You have the floor, Councillor McFarlane.
Mr Mayor, the deletion of those few words was just a bit of a technicality, and they perhaps didn't need to be there in the first place. Both the applicants considered here did submit a request for consideration, and as a result of that assessment, the recommendations have flowed through. I point out, Mr Mayor, recommendation 3, and going through this process, we've identified that there's a number of areas of sponsorship, whether we call them grants, sponsorship, events, sponsorships, etc. So what item 3 is to request a report following a review of the current sponsorship programs to see how we can tidy those up and make sure that we are looking at equity in the process of allocating sponsorship to our community. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McFarlane. Councillor Gibson, would you like to speak?
No, thank you.
It's my parrot that does that. Any other councillor wish to speak? I'm supposed to do the comedy, by the way. No other councillor wish to speak? Councillor McFarlane, do you wish to close? Okay. We've had speakers, councillors. I'll ask for votes in favour. Councillor White not present. Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor O'Callaghan, Councillor Clancy, Councillor Milmus. Carried unanimously. Usher, please return Councillor White to the chamber. I look up each time to see who takes the usher's job.
Manage organisational performance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Councillors, Councillor White has returned to the chamber, and we'll move to item 17.3, authorisation of councillors for certification of the 2018-19 financial report and performance statement. Do I have a mover? Councillor Howe.
Happy to move, Mr Mayor.
To move. Someone to second. Councillor Harriman.
Happy to second, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Any opposition, councillors? No opposition. Councillor Howe, do you wish to speak?
Just briefly, sir, this just ticks off a requirement we have under the Local Government Act. It requires the financial report and performance statements to be presented to the Auditor General's office so they can provide a report back to us, and it requires it to be signed by 2 councillors. This resolution just authorises Councillor McFarlane and Councillor White to sign the reports.
Thank you, Councillor Howe. Councillor Harriman.
There's a couple of councillors who might do it more eloquently. I'm beholden to them, Mr Mayor.
Oh, well done, well done. Okay, any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor McFarlane.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just briefly, as Councillor White mentioned before, the Victorian Auditor General's office have only approved today the closing report and management letter associated with our performance statement and financial reports. So all is good to go from that point of view. But I would like to say that in the process, and the Audit Committee did go through this documentation last week and met with the Auditor General's office contractor, who indicated entire satisfaction with the information provided and how well our staff had done in preparing the appropriate report. So it's very pleasing, Mr Mayor, and that was further reiterated by our 3 external auditors who happen to sit on other local government audit committees, and they made the same comments at how this was one of the best audits that they've seen at this council, and they suggested that we were up there with the top in the state. So, as well as having an operating surplus of $3.034 million, we also have a very positive tick from the Auditor General's office, and that means that we're in a very good state, Mr Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor McFarlane. Good news indeed. Any other councillor wish to speak? No, Councillor? Yes, I thought you might, Councillor White.
Only, Mr Mayor, to reiterate the remarks of Councillor McFarlane, and we're I believe, very fortunate as a council to have the calibre of auditors as our external audit member panel, and chaired by a lady by the name of Bev Excel, who does a fine job in leading the Audit and Risk Committee process, and there's continuing work being undertaken by the collective of the Audit and Risk Committee and all the staff of this organisation, and that continue to refine the way in which the Audit and Risk Committee does operate, and like Councillor McFarlane did say, the Audit Committee external members were very impressed with the quality of the result achieved, but also the way in which the auditors, VAGO rep contractor auditors, did speak of the staff here, who have really been very cooperative in terms of any issues that have been raised to get the answers they require to be satisfied from an auditing point of view. And so, Mr CEO, I'm sure you were very happy with to hear all those words, and so obviously there's continuing work going on to improve the systems and procedures that we have within the place, and I think there's a very strong collaborative effort going into that to make that happen.
Thank you, Councillor White. Any other councillor wish to speak? If not, Councillor Howe, you're up again. Okay. Having had speakers, councillors, we'll put it to the vote. Councillor in favour, I'm looking for, Councillor White, Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Gibson, Councillor Law, Councillor Howe, Councillor Harriman, Councillor O'Callaghan, Councillor Clancy and myself, carried unanimously. Move on to item 17.4, councillors, very procedural matter, tabling of Assembly of Councillors' records. Do I have a mover? Councillor Gibson.
Happy to second.
Councillor Clancy. Do I have any opposition? No opposition. Do you wish to speak, councillor Gibson? Procedural. This is cruelty. No opposition, and no speakers, carried unanimously. I think everybody's aware that it is Councillor Gibson's wedding anniversary and she wishes to finish quickly. Urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business, councillors? I've not been notified of any. On that basis, we'll move forward. That's right. At this point, councillors, we come to the end of the section of the meeting that is open to the public, and we move into close to consider contractual matters, etc. Do I have a mover to close the meeting? Thank you. Who said that? Thank you. Councillor Harriman, Councillor Gibson. I take it no opposition. Take it no speakers. Carried unanimously. Members of the gallery, you're welcome to join us for a cup of... There are only 2 left. Join us for a cup of tea and a biscuit. Yeah.
Lisa's doing the road trip thing, so I'd like to meet you.
Okay.
So bye to our YouTubers.
And we should also, don't go. We say goodbye to people who've watched us on YouTube. Thank you for joining us, and join us again next month.